Earthquakes, storms, heat waves, extreme cold, landslides, tsunamis, wildfires, cyclones, volcanoes, drought. These are natural hazards that threaten to destroy lives and livelihoods. More than 2.7 billion people were affected, and more than $1.3 trillion were lost between 2000 and 2011 due to disasters. In the Africa and Arab regions, another contributor to disaster is conflict. Here, close to 10.4 million people were internally displaced by conflict last year, and a further 1.3 million were displaced by weather-related hazards. Although natural disasters can't be prevented, the impact of disasters as a result of these hazards can be mitigated. Risks can be reduced, and communities can become more resilient. That is why the UNISDR believes in creating a culture of prevention rather than reaction. The UNISDR was created to assist governments and other stakeholders to understand how risk is created and how it can be reduced and prevented. Data and analysis show that disasters often occur because of human behavior and activity, so it becomes important to move conceptually from reacting to disasters to managing risk proactively. Through education, raising awareness, scientific and local knowledge, better urban planning and greater investment, lives and money can be saved. This is the main plenary hall at the first Joint Africa Arab Platform on Disaster Risk Reduction, hosted by the UNISDR and held in Tunis, the capital city of Tunisia. This 5-day event drew representatives from 50 countries across the two regions. These representatives came from governments, intergovernmental organizations, non-governmental organizations, academia, women, youth, and civil society. They took stock of progress made in the implementation of the Sendai Framework and the regional strategies on disaster risk reduction. Political commitment to achieving this implementation was also sought. This event combined the 7th Africa Regional Platform, the 6th high-level meeting, and the 4th Arab Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction. The theme was Towards Disaster Risk-Informed and Inclusive Sustainable Development.
So we have regional platforms every 2 years, and up to now the one in Arab countries and one for the African countries were separately held. But as we all know, disasters do not have boundaries. They do not respect frontiers. And many of the natural disasters that happen and affect these countries in these regions, such as drought, such as floods, these do not have any boundaries. I would also talk about dust storm as well. So in order to all the countries from the two regions to come together and really share their best practice and also the lessons learned, the more diverse the experience, the better. So that is why we thought that it is the moment to hold a joint regional platform.
The African and Arab regions face similar hazards from natural disasters. Both regions are prone to severe drought, and floods can have devastating consequences. Just weeks before the platform, the host country Tunisia suffered from flash floods. The storm that you had recently, what was the extent of the storm, and did it change your strategy at all?
Enfin, ce qu'on a eu, effectivement, les inondations à Nabil.
The floods that we had in Abu province recently are not the reason why we changed our strategy, because this Africa Arab platform has been in the pipeline for some time and the national strategy has been in place.
Depuis bien longtemps, mais le hasard du calendrier a fait que on ait des inondations juste avant cette plateforme-là qui nous rappelle.
But by coincidence, we had the floods just before this platform, and that reminds us and gives this platform more importance for Tunisian citizens, the media, and decision makers.
Et des donneurs d'ordre. Mais justement, notre but.
Our goal is to change the way we plan for disaster and learn from experience. Therefore, we want a long-term strategy for the management of these disasters.
et il faut attendre une autre catastrophe pour nous réveiller.
Both regions also have to deal with the consequences of poverty and inequality, unplanned and rapid urbanization, and poor land management. Representatives from the two regions noted the many similarities and identified shared lessons and experiences. They agreed on ways to enhance future collaboration in the implementation of the Sendai Framework. Across the two regions, 20 countries have so far aligned their national strategies to the global plan for reducing disaster losses.
The issue of disaster risk management cannot be solved isolated. So we need a platform. We need to share lessons amongst ourselves. So it's a multi-sectoral issue. It's a cross-cutting issue. So we need to work together, coordinated, synergy, so that we can create resilience to the effect of the climate change on disaster risk reduction. So we need to put on, and it is a responsibility of all the citizens living on this planet to look at the issue of disaster risk management very seriously.
And what is the AU's strategy particularly?
Our strategy is to build resilience both at the production sector, because as we know that the most vulnerable people suffer more from the disaster risk reduction, and this building resilience on production, it is on agriculture, because their main activity is agriculture. So that is why we, the African Union, wants to build resilience for the productive sector or productive system, as well as the livelihood of our citizens. We have Agenda 2063. Under the Agenda 2063, the aspiration number 1 is aligned with the Sendai Framework, which is a prosperous Africa based on inclusive growth and sustainable development. When we talk of sustainable development, we want to ensure that we are really keeping our protecting our ecosystem, and then we are building resilience against the nefast effect of the shock of climate change.
We're talking here about disaster risk reduction in a context where global hunger is increasing. According to the report which is released by FAO recently, 1 out of every 9 people on the earth are now hungry, food insecure. So, and the situation is worse in Africa. Close to 21% of the African population is undernourished, which is a very high number. And what are the causes of this situation, and particularly the increase we're talking about over the last 2 years? This increase is driven mostly by natural hazards, conflicts. So if we want really to achieve the Sustainable Development Goal, we have to find the strategies, the best strategy to manage disaster risk and to strengthen the resilience of the population.
And talking about conflict, there's also a lot of people displaced and moved, and what happens then?
Yeah, this conflict is a very important factor driving food insecurity in Africa and even in the Arab region here. Most of the several countries are struggling with conflict, which leads to population displacement. And when we talk about population displacement, we talk about an increase in food insecurity, and this require this call for conflict-sensitive programming when we are designing program to tackle food insecurity in such context.
You have been working for years now globally with countries most at risk. And you've been going on the ground and talking to them.
Say, countries after countries, least developed countries in the Asia, Africa, Latin America, even Arab regions, they are so vulnerable. The communities are so vulnerable, they simply can't cope with the, say, more disasters are striking. Right now, we have seen that in Indonesia, there is say tsunami. In say Bangladesh Indian coast, there is a hurricane, cyclone. In say US coast, east coast, southeast coast, Florida, there is hurricane. So, these are nowadays a common phenomena. Even say 30 years back, 40 years back, 50 years back, there are more or less disasters, but nowadays there are more intense and frequent disasters, and the cost of disasters are going up and up. So, we need more resilient building, more awareness, more planning, more strategy, but with participation of the local communities, with participation of the local bodies, with participation of the community people, so that they own it. And also not only at the subnational level, national level, but also sub-regional level and regional level, we need more awareness, more planning, and also more implementation.
Who are all the stakeholders, and are they all putting in as much, or are they all as excited about it as they should be?
I think governments are. I think the challenge is we don't want them to look at these three particular frameworks in seclusion. We need them to look at them as one whole leading to one goal. As far as the United Nations is concerned now, I mean, one of the key aspects of the reform that we're doing now and the messages that we're getting is that we all, as the United Nations, should rally around the sustainable development goals and achieving sustainable development. This is the message I'm getting, and I think to do that we have to bring as many stakeholders as we can, not only governments who have been doing it for a long time, but now to bring the communities, all of society to be involved in developing these, being party to it and committing to it to take it forward.
The UNISDR 2015 Global Assessment Report estimated annual losses of $314 billion in the built environment as a result of tropical cyclones, earthquakes, tsunamis and floods. This figure would be higher with the inclusion of the impact of droughts on the agriculture sector. The Sendai Framework highlights the lack of regulation and incentives for private disaster risk reduction investment as an underlying risk driver, and calls for businesses to integrate disaster risk into their management practices. In the fall of 2015, after the international community adopted the Sendai Framework, the Private Sector Alliance for Disaster Resilient Societies, or ARISE, was established. The goal of ARISE is to create risk-resilient societies by involving the private sector in collaboration with the public sector and other stakeholders to deliver on the targets of the Sendai Framework. In the Africa and Arab regions, the engagement with the private sector has been limited to date. Is the private sector here very cooperative and keen to contribute?
C'est extrêmement important que le secteur privé soit partie prenante de.
It is extremely important that the private sector is involved in this process. Actually, there is a will. It exists. We feel that it is starting to change. I think there is an awareness that it is starting. Everyone is aware of climate change, but somewhat reluctantly.
Il y a une volonté que le secteur privé, parce que c'est essentiel.
It is essential for the private sector to participate, but there is a lot still to do, and it's not easy.
Il y a beaucoup à faire, il y a un travail pour amener. C'est pas facile, hein?
Well, we're really focused on private sector development and trying to bring the private sector into supporting what are really public sector agenda items. So we work in South Africa, we work in East and Northern Africa, West Africa, trying to build a bridge in terms of the language. So often government and often the CSO community speak in terms that don't resonate to the private sector, but they're often shared interests. And so our focus is really creating public-private collaboration. And in this area of disaster risk reduction, there's huge opportunity in that space. And we're trying to say, well, preemptively, let's not wait until there's a need for relief. What can we do to better educate the private sector on where the opportunities are, give them a sense of what is needed, and the forecasting that goes on at fora like this. And there are stakeholders here who can predict these are areas where we will have a disaster. How do we get the private sector to take proactive, preemptive steps to support?
The African Union's role and involvement in ARISE?
That will be more from the Economic, Social and Cultural Council, of which I am Deputy Presiding Officer of. We serve as the collective of civil society amongst all member states of the African Union, and our job is to ensure that indeed we incorporate private sector, non-state actors, civil society, women's groups, youth groups in the implementation of all African Union decisions. So for us it will be a matter of availing our national chapters as well as our regional and continental presence to ensuring that the private sector indeed has its role manifest, especially in the form of our advisory opinions to the Assembly at the African Union.
2 reports were released at the Tunis platform. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC report, and the UNISDR report. Let's first look at the IPCC report.
So that one has been long waited, and a lot of focus has been, media has reported a lot on that. It is an alarming report because actually what they are telling us is that although we still can meet the agreement of the Paris Agreement in COP21 in 2015, we are actually running behind and really have to put our acts together. So that's why the Secretary General, in addition to the COP process, has convened the Climate Summit in 2019 September in New York. This is to get together the political will of the countries. And the report is very important for disaster risk reduction because what we are seeing now, all the extreme weather events, this is becoming not extreme, exceptional things, but unfortunately the new normal. So this is why, from our point of view at UNISDR, the report from IPCC is very important.
The UNISDR report was launched on the 13th of October, the International Day for Disaster Reduction.
Now, this report has focused on economic loss. The Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction have 7 targets, and the third one is to reduce economic loss in proportion of the GDP. This report has found that actually what we know of what is the amount of economic loss caused by disasters is really not even half of what we should know. The report says that the economic loss of which we know is generated by only 37% of the major disasters that are reported. So a lot of the disasters which are not reported, which include the floods, the droughts that are happening in the Arab and the African region, the economic loss from here is not in that report. The report also says, in relation to the IPCC report as well, that 91% of the natural hazards that we are experiencing is caused by climate change. So what should we do? We need to reinforce our message that every country needs to have a very strong disaster loss database to understand what is the risk they face, and based on that have a robust national and local strategy for disaster risk reduction. This is also one of the targets of the Sendai Framework, and we are working, supporting the countries for this.
Let's talk about coherence. And this is coherence between climate change, disaster risk reduction, and the SDGs. What do you mean by this, and what has to be done in terms of coherence?
Well, coherence, first of all, when we speak about it, we speak about, as you said, the 3 main what we call post-2015 international agreements. There are others, but these are the ones we're referring to in particular, which is the Sustainable Development Goals that was agreed by member states, the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, and the Paris Climate Change Agreement. So for disaster risk reduction, there are elements in the Climate Change Agreement as well as the Sustainable Development Goals which require input or the mainstreaming of disaster risk reduction activities and programs. Why? Because when we look at development, I mean, the overall goal for us is to have sustainable development. And within that, there are many sectors, many disciplines that come in. And one of them is disaster risk reduction, because we have learned, and there are many studies out there, that investing in risk reduction will save over time many resources. And it's also ensures that we inject the issue of resilience, the matter of resilience in all development programs, investments, be they from the private sector or from the public sector. So it's all really about risk-informed development. It's about good development.
So lately there seems to have been many more disasters happening in a shorter period of time, and also economic losses have been greater as a result of this. So how do governments deal with this?
I think this goes directly to one of the most important things of the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, this agreement that I mentioned. It has a number of elements in it, but the key the key underlying elements are 4 priorities. Out of those 4 priorities, the first one is about understanding risk. And for me, if you don't understand where your risk is coming from, where your vulnerable areas in your country are, you won't be able, and where the losses are, you won't be able to judge where the losses are coming from. So for us, it's important to have a system in place to collect the data, to make risk assessments, for example, and ensure that you have the information that will help you understand where best to invest your resources to ensure that your communities, your properties, and your society is resilient when a disaster from a natural hazard occurs. Linked to that directly is priority 2, the second priority, which focuses on the issue of governance. Having institutions in place, basically, that will actually be able to carry out, coordinate what is needed and carry out the programs to roll out disaster risk reduction programs. That would be the area that would be the stimulus. It will set the stage for engaging communities, engaging the private sector, and so on. The third one is about investing in disaster risk reduction, and this is focuses, among others, about smart investment, risk-informed investment. When we look at there are reports that state that 80% of the construction and infrastructure that's going to be built in the next 2 decades is going to be from the private sector. So that needs to be informed properly, and that we don't build without having some sort of precautions made to avoid disasters actually wiping out resources. The fourth one is a classic one. It's about early warning and making sure that we have the early warning systems in place and response system in place, and most importantly, recovery system in place. So when a disaster happens, we are actually able to, as the Sendai Framework states, build back better than we had in the past.
Coming home with take-home work in terms of things that need to be done, areas of focus, and the nature of involvement of stakeholders. What we have learned clearly is that we do need to have appropriate systems like early warning systems in place. Secondly, we need to have a bit of more extensive exchange of information with our communities and understand the dynamics and environments in which the communities operate in, so that the strategies developed, they talk into their situations. And also that it is there's value in preparing for these occurrences well in advance, rather than waiting for an occurrence to happen and then responding. Well, we are resource constrained as member states. That's a reality we're all faced with. But again, the meeting, opened us into possibilities of actually achieving more with the little that is there, and also tapping a lot into the traditional knowledge and traditional practices that we already have in place.
As the platform drew to a close, the two regions committed to collaborate on a number of strategies and actions, such as ensuring that disaster risk reduction strategies in the African and Arab states are aligned with the Sendai Framework and are in place by 2020, and accelerating efforts to collect and account for disaster losses by 2020 to guide the investment decisions of development planners, business leaders, risk officers, and finance ministries.
So we will have two declarations, one from the African countries and the other from the Arab countries. We will also have a joint communique. What we want to see is a strong political commitment coming out from all of the countries here, saying that we do need to tackle disaster risk reduction. Secondly, I talked about the target to have a substantive number of countries, member states, to have both national and local disaster risk reduction strategies by the year 2020. This is something that we have to commit to, and I want to see a strong commitment coming out from this platform. I also want to see a message reinforced that the Sendai Framework, it is a multi-stakeholder framework. It's not only the national governments nor even the local governments, but it is the stakeholders such as the private sector, the civil society, which will all work together to achieve the framework. This has to come out. And finally, inclusivity is very important. Disasters strike the most vulnerable people, women, children, people living with disabilities. So we need to make sure that no one is left behind, and that message needs to come out from the platform as well.
The outcomes of this conference will feed into the processes of the Global Platform on Disaster Risk Reduction, which will happen in Geneva, Switzerland in May 2019.